The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as James Walker methodically restocked the shelves of his neighborhood grocery store in the quiet suburb of Springfield, Massachusetts. The familiar scent of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the aisles, a comforting constant in his 20 years of running Walker's Market. Through the large storefront windows, golden autumn leaves danced across the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the strange unease that had settled in his stomach over the past few weeks. It started with barely noticeable discrepancies in his inventory, a missing loaf of bread here, an apple there. At first, James attributed it to his own oversight, but the security cameras told a different story. A small boy, no more than 8 years old, would slip into the store during the busiest hours, moving with the practiced stealth of someone far beyond his years. The child's appearance didn't match his actions. His clothes, while showing signs of wear, were clean and well-maintained. His sandy brown hair was neatly combed, and his bright green backpack, though faded, spoke of a life that once knew care and comfort. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor as James watched the security footage for the third time that week. The boy's movements were precise, calculated. He never took more than he could easily conceal, and always chose essential items. Apples, bread, peanut butter, items that could sustain without preparation. But it was his eyes that haunted James the most, wide, alert, and filled with a mixture of fear and determination that no child should have to carry. "Hey, Mr. Walker," called out Lisa, his longtime employee, breaking his concentration. "That kid's back again." James turned to the security monitor, watching as the boy navigated through the aisles with familiar precision. Today, he wore a navy blue sweater that hung slightly loose on his small frame, his movements careful and deliberate as he examined a loaf of whole wheat bread. The sight stirred something deep within James, memories of his own childhood, of times when his single mother had struggled to keep food on the table, of the shame and hunger that had shaped his early years. The store owner's fingers drummed thoughtfully against the counter as he observed the child's practiced routine. There was something different about today, a slight tremor in the boy's hands, dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. As James watched, the child reached for a jar of peanut butter, his movements less steady than usual. "Lisa, watch the register for a bit," James said quietly, his decision made. He wouldn't confront the boy, not directly. Something told him there was more to this story than simple theft. And his years of reading people, of understanding the subtle stories written in their choices and movements, had rarely led him astray. The boy must have sensed something was different today. His head snapped up as he neared the exit, eyes darting around with increased urgency. James kept his distance, moving casually between the aisles as the child slipped out the door and into the crisp autumn air. The boy's sneakers, scuffed but still functional, barely made a sound as he darted down the sidewalk. James followed at a careful distance, his heart heavy with concern. The neighborhood began to change as they moved away from the commercial district, well-maintained homes giving way to abandoned buildings and overgrown lots. The boy's path wound through narrow alleyways and empty parking lots, each turn revealing a deeper story of survival in the shadows of their seemingly prosperous community. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across broken windows and graffiti-covered walls as the child approached a dilapidated apartment building. James watched as the boy glanced furtively over his shoulder before slipping through a gap in a chain-link fence. The building loomed before him, a silent testament to better days, its red brick facade still hinting at former elegance beneath years of neglect. A cool breeze carried the sound of distant traffic and rustling leaves as James approached the building. He paused, considering his next move. The boy had disappeared into the darkness beyond a partially open door, and for a moment, James questioned whether he should proceed. But the memory of those haunted eyes, too old for such a young face, pushed him forward. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he entered the building, the musty air thick with dust and decay. Somewhere above, a pigeon cooed softly, the sound echoing through empty hallways. James followed the faint sound of whispered voices, his footsteps careful and measured on the worn wooden floor. The voices led him to a room on the ground floor, where warm light spilled through the crack of a door left slightly ajar. James approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. As he peered through the gap, the scene before him unfolded like a punch to the gut. The boy was kneeling beside a small girl, no more than 5 or 6, carefully unwrapping the stolen bread. Between them lay a thin blanket where a scrawny dog watched with hopeful eyes, its tail thumping weakly against the floor. The door creaked as James shifted his weight, and the boy's head snapped up, his body instantly positioning itself between the door and the little girl. The fear in his eyes was replaced by fierce determination, a protective instinct that spoke volumes about the burden he carried. "Wait," James said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace as the boy reached for what appeared to be a makeshift weapon, a piece of broken chair leg. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm James Walker, from the grocery store." He remained in the doorway, making no move to enter the room. "I just want to help." The boy's grip on the wooden stake tightened, his knuckles white with tension. The little girl behind him clutched at his sweater, her wide eyes fixed on James with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The dog had risen to its feet, thin body trembling as it positioned itself in front of both children. "You're going to call the police," the boy accused, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his stance. "You're going to make them take us away." James shook his head slowly, maintaining eye contact with the child. "No police," he promised. "But I can't leave you here either. It's not safe." He gestured to the crumbling walls around them, the broken windows that let in the increasingly cold autumn air. "At least let me hear your story. Maybe we can figure something out together." The silence that followed was heavy with tension, broken only by the soft whimpers of the dog and the distant sound of traffic. The boy's eyes darted between James and his sister, internal conflict visible in every line of his small body. Finally, his shoulders slumped slightly, though his grip on the makeshift weapon didn't loosen. "I'm Tommy," he said quietly. "This is my sister Sarah, and that's Max." He nodded toward the dog, who had settled back down but maintained a watchful eye on the newcomer. "We've been here since." His voice caught, and he swallowed hard before continuing. "Since our parents didn't come back." James felt his heart constrict at the simple statement, at the worlds of pain contained in those few words. He took a careful step into the room, noting how Tommy tensed but didn't retreat. The space was surprisingly clean despite its deteriorated state. Cardboard boxes had been arranged to create makeshift furniture, and a collection of blankets in one corner suggested where they slept. Small touches, a dried flower in a cracked cup, a few worn books carefully stacked, spoke of attempts to create something resembling a home in this desolate place. "How long have you been here?" James asked gently, lowering himself to sit on the floor, making himself less threatening by matching their level. Tommy's eyes clouded with uncertainty. 2 months, maybe? Mom and Dad went on a business trip. They were supposed to be gone for a week. His voice grew quieter. They always called every night, but then the calls just stopped. Sarah pressed closer to her brother, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of his sweater. "Tommy takes care of us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He makes sure we have food and reads me stories just like Mommy used to." The magnitude of what these children had endured, what they were still enduring, settled over James like a heavy blanket. An 8-year-old boy, carrying the weight of responsibility for his sister and their dog, surviving through wit and desperation in an abandoned building, all while protecting them from a system he feared would tear them apart. "You've been very brave," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. But you don't have to do this alone anymore." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I have a home, with spare rooms and warm beds. My wife, Caroline, she's always wanted children. We could help you, give you a safe place to stay while we figure things out." Tommy's grip on the wooden stake finally loosened, though wariness remained in his posture. "You won't separate us? Promise." James met the boy's gaze steadily. "I promise. You, Sarah, and Max, you stay together. That's non-negotiable." As if understanding the gravity of the moment, Max stood and cautiously approached James, sniffing his extended hand before giving it a tentative lick. Tommy watched this interaction closely, and something in his expression shifted, a tiny crack in the armor he'd built around himself and his sister. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the broken windows and filling the room with a golden glow. In that moment, as James watched Tommy struggle with the decision that no child should have to make, he knew his life was about to change irrevocably. The boy who had caught his attention through petty theft was about to teach him lessons in courage, resilience, and the true meaning of family. "Okay," Tommy finally said, his voice small but determined. "But if you're lying, I'm not," James interrupted gently. "You have my word, and tomorrow we'll go back to my store, and you can help me stock the shelves properly this time." The ghost of a smile crossed Tommy's face at this, the first glimpse of the child beneath the protector. As James helped gather their meager belongings, the books, the blankets, the few precious photos Tommy pulled from his backpack, he sent a quick text to Caroline, "Coming home with some special guests. It's a long story, but I need you to trust me." The response came almost immediately. "Always do. How many plates should I set?" James looked at the small family before him. A boy forced to grow up too fast, a little girl who still believed in her brother's ability to make everything right, and a loyal dog who had stayed by their side through it all. "3," he typed back, "plus one very hungry dog." The autumn evening wrapped around them as they left the abandoned building, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tommy held his sister's hand tightly as they walked, Max padding faithfully beside them. James led the way, his mind already racing with plans and preparations, but his heart fuller than it had been in years. Behind them, the old building stood silent, its empty rooms holding the echoes of two children's courage and determination. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenges, and the promise of something none of them had dared to hope for, a chance at being whole again. The walk to James's house felt like crossing a bridge between two worlds. Every step carried them further from the shadows of survival and closer to the possibility of something they'd almost forgotten existed: hope. The streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting pools of warm light on the sidewall. Kay ahead, as if illuminating their path to a new beginning. Sarah's small hand remained firmly clasped in Tommy's as they walked, her tired steps growing slower with each block. Without hesitation, James offered to carry her, and after a cautious nod from Tommy, lifted the exhausted child into his arms. Her head soon settled against his shoulder, dark curls spilling over his jacket, while Tommy walked beside them, one hand resting protectively on Max's head. The transformation of the neighborhood around them told its own story. Broken concrete giving way to tree-lined streets, abandoned lots replaced by well-tended gardens. Tommy's eyes darted from house to house, taking in the glowing windows and parked cars, signs of normal life that had become foreign to him over the past months. Max trotted alongside them, his energy seemingly renewed by the promise of somewhere warm to sleep. James's house appeared around the final corner, a two-story colonial with white trim and a wraparound porch, the kind of home that featured in Sarah's bedtime stories. Lights spilled from the windows, and through the kitchen window, they could see Caroline moving about, her shadow dancing across the drawn curtains. Tommy's steps faltered slightly at the sight. "It's okay to be scared," James said quietly, shifting Sarah's weight in his arms. "Change is always frightening, even when it's for the better." Tommy's fingers twisted in the fabric of his sweater. "What if your wife doesn't want us?" he whispered, voicing the fear that had been building with each step. Before James could respond, the front door opened, spilling warm light onto the porch. Caroline stood in the doorway, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid, wearing a flour-dusted apron that suggested she'd been stress baking, her usual response to uncertainty. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. Her husband carrying a sleeping child, a wary boy with old eyes, and a painfully thin dog. But Caroline had always been quick to understand, to read between the lines of life's unexpected chapters. Without hesitation, she stepped aside, opening the door wider. "I made chicken pot pie," she said, her voice gentle and matter-of-fact, as if taking in 3 strays on a Tuesday evening was the most natural thing in the world. "And there's fresh bread cooling on the counter." The scent of home cooking wrapped around them as they stepped inside, and Max's tail began to wag with newfound enthusiasm. Tommy remained close to the door, his body tense, ready to run if necessary. But Sarah stirred in James's arms, her nose twitching at the familiar smell of food. "Why don't we get everyone settled first?" Caroline suggested, noting Tommy's unease. "There's a bathroom upstairs where you can clean up, and I think I have some old t-shirts that would work as pajamas." She spoke directly to Tommy, recognizing him as the decision-maker, the protector. The boy's eyes darted around the space, noting exits, assessing threats, a habit born of necessity, before settling on his sister, who was now fully awake and looking around with undisguised wonder at the cozy living room with its overstuffed chairs and family photos. "Come on, buddy," James said softly. "Let's show you where everything is. Max, too, we can set up a bed for him in the mudroom. It's warm in there." The tour of the house felt like a journey through a museum of normal life, the kind of life Tommy and Sarah had lost. The guest rooms upstairs, with their clean sheets and soft pillows, seemed almost too perfect to be real. The bathroom, with its fluffy towels and hot running water, made Sarah gasp with delight, while Tommy ran his fingers over the smooth porcelain of the sink with an expression of disbelief. Caroline appeared with armfuls of clothes, soft t-shirts and sweatpants that would swim on their thin frames, but were clean and warm. "Take your time," she said, setting the clothes on the counter. "When you're ready, Dee. And we'll be waiting downstairs." She paused at the door, then added, "And Tommy, thank you for trusting us enough to come this far." The words seemed to reach something deep inside the boy, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked. His lower lip trembled, and he bit down on it hard, fighting back tears that had been held at bay for far too long. Caroline pretended not to notice, giving him the dignity of privacy as she closed the door softly behind her. Downstairs, James was settling Max into a makeshift bed made from old blankets, placing bowls of food and water nearby. The dog's tail hadn't stopped wagging since they'd entered the house, as if he too understood that something fundamental had shifted in their world. "I found them in the old Parker building," James explained quietly to his wife as she joined him in the kitchen. "They've been there for months, Caroline. Months. Their parents went on a trip and never came back. Tommy's been taking care of his sister all this time, stealing food to keep them alive." Caroline's hands stilled on the pie she was cutting. "We'll need to contact the authorities eventually," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Find out what happened to their parents." "I know," James agreed, running a hand through his graying hair. "But not tonight. Tonight, they need to feel safe, to rest, to remember what it's like to be children again." The sound of running water filtered down from upstairs, accompanied by Sarah's delighted giggles and Tommy's quieter voice giving instructions. It was a sound that filled the empty spaces of the house, spaces that had waited years to echo with children's voices. When Tommy and Sarah finally came downstairs, they were transformed. Clean faces emerged from borrowed clothes, their hair damp from the shower. Sarah's eyes were bright with excitement, but Tommy's wariness remained, though tempered now by exhaustion and the irresistible pull of safety. They gathered around the kitchen table, where Caroline had set out plates of steaming pot pie. Tommy helped Sarah into a chair, then hesitated before taking his own seat, as if unsure of his place in this domestic scene. But the first bite of food seemed to break something loose inside him. Tears slipped silently down his cheeks as he ate, years of tension beginning to unravel in the face of simple kindness. Sarah, less burdened by the weight of responsibility, was already chattering softly about the bubble bath and the princess bed upstairs. Max lay contentedly by Tommy's feet, occasionally raising his head to accept bits of chicken that Sarah snuck him under the table, while Caroline pretended not to notice. As the evening wore on, the children's exhaustion became more apparent. Sarah's head began to droop, and even Tommy's rigid posture softened. James and Caroline exchanged glances, years of marriage allowing for silent communication. "Time for bed, I think," Caroline said gently. "We could talk more tomorrow, figure everything out. Tonight, just rest." The process of getting them settled was both heartbreaking and healing. Sarah insisted on a bedtime story, producing a worn copy of Good Night Moon from her backpack. Caroline sat on the edge of the bed, reading softly while Sarah curled against her side, already half asleep. Tommy stood in the doorway of his own room, uncertainty written in every line of his body. The bed seemed to overwhelm him with its abundance of pillows and blankets, its promise of comfort after months of sleeping on hard floors. "It's okay to let go a little," James told him quietly. "You're not alone anymore." The boy's fingers traced the pattern on the quilt, his voice barely a whisper when he spoke. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up back there. That this isn't real." "It's real," James assured him. "And tomorrow when you wake up, we'll still be here. Sarah will be safe in her room. Max will be downstairs. Nothing bad is going to happen tonight." Tom, I nodded, climbing into bed with the careful movements of someone still expecting to be told it was all a mistake. James pulled the blankets up around him, an act so paternal it made his heart ache. "Thank you," Tommy mumbled, his eyes already closing, "for following me today." "Thank you for letting me," James replied softly, but Tommy was already asleep, his face finally peaceful, years of worry smoothed away by exhaustion and the beginning of trust. In the hallway, James found Caroline standing in Sarah's doorway, watching the little girl sleep. He wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders, and they stood there together, witnesses to the miracle of children finding rest in a safe place. "We can't let them go," Caroline whispered, voicing what they both knew. "Whatever happened to their parents, whatever comes next, they're ours now." James thought of the empty rooms that had waited so long for children's laughter, of the years they'd spent trying to have a family of their own. He thought of Tommy's fierce protection of his sister, of Sarah's resilient spirit, of Max's unwavering loyalty. "They've always been ours," he replied. "We just didn't know it until today." The house settled around them, creaking softly as old houses do. But tonight the sounds seemed different, less lonely, more like the contented sighs of a home finally complete. Tomorrow would bring challenges, questions to answer, authorities to face, a future to plan. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, a new family had found its beginning in the most unexpected of ways. Upstairs, Tommy stirred in his sleep, reaching instinctively for a sister who no longer needed his constant protection. Down the hall, Sarah cuddled deeper into her pillows, her dreams finally free of worry. And in the mudroom, Max's tail thumped softly against his blankets, keeping watch over the peace they'd found at last. The autumn wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying away the last echoes of their old life and welcoming the dawn of something new, something that had started with a shopkeeper's choice to follow a desperate child and had ended with the discovery that family isn't always about where you begin, but where you finally find your way home. As dawn broke over Springfield, the light filtering through unfamiliar curtains woke Tommy with a start. For a moment, panic seized his chest. The softness beneath him felt wrong after months of sleeping on hard floors. But then the events of the previous day came rushing back, James following him, the kindness in Caroline's eyes, the warmth of real food in his stomach. Still, old habits died hard. He slipped quietly from the bed, padding down the hallway to check on Sarah. His sister lay sprawled across her new bed, dark curls fanned out on the pillow, one arm wrapped around a stuffed bear Caroline had produced from somewhere. The sight of her sleeping so peacefully made his throat tight. For the first time in months, she looked like a child again, not a survivor. The house creaked softly as Tommy made his way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and something sweet baking. He found Caroline in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she pulled muffins from the oven. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver strands in her auburn hair, making them shine like threads of starlight. "Good morning," she said softly, not turning around. "I thought you might be an early riser." She set the muffins on a cooling rack, the steam rising in fragrant swirls. "Would you like to help me make breakfast? Sarah mentioned you make really good scrambled eggs." The normalcy of the request, the casual way she included him in this morning ritual, made Tommy's chest ache with a mixture of longing and fear. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the eggs she'd set out. "I used to help Mom with breakfast," he found himself saying, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Before." His voice ca. My nodded, climbing into bed with the careful movements of someone still expecting to be told it was all a mistake. James pulled the blankets up around him, an act so paternal it made his heart ache. "Thank you," Tommy mumbled, his eyes already closing, "for following me today." "Thank you for letting me," James replied softly, but Tommy was already asleep, his face finally peaceful, years of worry smoothed away by exhaustion and the beginning of trust. In the hallway, James found Caroline standing in Sarah's doorway, watching the little girl sleep. He wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders, and they stood there together, witnesses to the miracle of children finding rest in a safe place. "We can't let them go," Caroline whispered, voicing what they both knew. "Whatever happened to their parents, whatever comes next, they're ours now." James thought of the empty rooms that had waited so long for children's laughter, of the years they'd spent trying to have a family of their own. He thought of Tommy's fierce protection of his sister, of Sarah's resilient spirit, of Max's unwavering loyalty. "They've always been ours," he replied. "We just didn't know it until today." The house settled around them, creaking softly as old houses do. But tonight the sounds seemed different, less lonely, more like the contented sighs of a home finally complete. Tomorrow would bring challenges, questions to answer, authorities to face, a future to plan. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, a new family had found its beginning in the most unexpected of ways. Upstairs, Tommy stirred in his sleep, reaching instinctively for a sister who no longer needed his constant protection. Down the hall, Sarah cuddled deeper into her pillows, her dreams finally free of worry. And in the mudroom, Max's tail thumped softly against his blankets, keeping watch over the peace they'd found at last. The autumn wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying away the last echoes of their old life and welcoming the dawn of something new. Something that had started with a shopkeeper's choice to follow a desperate child and had ended with the discovery that family isn't always about where you begin, but where you finally find your way home. As dawn broke over Springfield, the light filtering through unfamiliar curtains woke Tommy with a start. For a moment, panic seized his chest. The softness beneath him felt wrong after months of sleeping on hard floors. But then the events of the previous day came rushing back, James following him, the kindness in Caroline's eyes, the warmth of real food in his stomach. Still, old habits died hard. He slipped quietly from the bed, padding down the hallway to check on Sarah. His sister lay sprawled across her new bed, dark curls fanned out on the pillow, one arm wrapped around a stuffed bear Caroline had produced from somewhere. The sight of her sleeping so peacefully made his throat tight. For the first time in months, she looked like a child again, not a survivor. The house creaked softly as Tommy made his way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and something sweet baking. He found Caroline in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she pulled muffins from the oven. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver strands in her auburn hair, making them shine like threads of starlight. "Good morning," she said softly, not turning around. "I thought you might be an early riser." She set the muffins on a cooling rack, the steam rising in fragrant swirls. "Would you like to help me make breakfast? Sarah mentioned you make really good scrambled eggs." The normalcy of the request, the casual way she included him in this morning ritual, made Tommy's chest ache with a mixture of longing and fear. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the eggs she'd set out. "I used to help Mom with breakfast," he found himself saying, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Before." His voice awed, and he focused intently on cracking an egg into the bowl. Caroline's hand settled briefly on his shoulder, warm and steady. "Tell me about her," she suggested gently. "About both your parents. I'd like to know them through your eyes." And so, as the morning light filled the kitchen, Tommy began to talk. He told her about his mother's laugh, how it would bubble up from nowhere and fill the whole house with joy. About his father's terrible dad jokes and amazing bedtime stories. About family game nights and weekend picnics and the way his parents always kissed goodnight, no matter what. The eggs were forgotten as the words poured out. Months of stored memories and grief finally finding release. Caroline listened, really listened, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just providing the safe space Tommy needed to remember. They were supposed to be gone for a week, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. A conference in Chicago. Mom called every night to check on us. Mrs. Henderson from next door was staying with us. But then one night, no call came. Or the next night, Mrs. Henderson tried calling the hotel, but he swallowed hard. She had a heart attack 2 days later. By the time the ambulance came, I'd already packed our bags and taken Sarah to the old building. I couldn't let them separate us. I promised Mom we'd always stay together. Caroline's eyes shone with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. You did an incredible job protecting your sister, Tommy. Your parents would be so proud of you. But now it's our turn to protect both of you. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted them. James, carrying a still sleepy Sarah, with Max trotting happily behind them. The dog immediately went to Tommy, pressing against his legs in silent support. Something smells amazing, James said, settling Sarah in a chair where she immediately reached for a warm muffin. His eyes took in Tommy's tear-stained face and Caroline's protective stance, understanding passing silently between the adults. Tommy was just helping me with breakfast, Caroline said smoothly, turning back to the stove. And telling me about your family's game nights. I was thinking we might start that tradition here. Once you're settled, we have quite a collection of board games gathering dust in the closet. The casual mention of a future, of traditions and belonging, made Tommy's heart skip. He looked at Sarah, happily devouring her muffin with crumbs on her chin, at Max contentedly sprawled by his feet, at James and Caroline moving around each other in the kitchen with practiced ease. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold, making the scene look like something from a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The warmth of the kitchen was real. The smell of coffee and muffins was real. The gentle touches and kind words were real. And slowly, like ice melting in spring, Tommy felt something inside him begin to thaw. I'm pretty good at Monopoly, he offered quietly, testing the waters of this new reality. James grinned. That's fighting words in this house, young man. Caroline's been the reigning Monopoly champion for 3 years running. For years, Caroline corrected with a wink. And I'm always up for a challenge. Sarah perked up, fully awake now. Can I be the dog piece? Mom always let me be the dog piece. Of course you can, sweetheart, Caroline assured her, sharing a knowing look with Tommy. Some traditions are meant to be kept. As they settled around the table for breakfast, the morning light, streaming through the windows, seemed to wrap them in a gentle embrace. Outside, the world was waking up to another ordinary day, but inside this kitchen, something extraordinary was taking place. The slow, careful weaving together of broken pieces into something new and whole. Tommy watched as James helped Sarah butter her toast, as Caroline slipped Max a piece of bacon under the table, as the morning unfolded with a peaceful rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. He thought about the abandoned building where they'd hidden for so long, about the fear and uncertainty that had been their constant companions. The contrast was almost overwhelming. But then Sarah's laugh rang out, bright and clear and unworried, at something James had said, and Tommy felt the last of his defenses crumble. This was what he'd been fighting for all those months. Not just survival, but the chance for his sister to laugh like that again, to be a child again. Caroline caught his eye across the table and smiled, not with pity or concern, but with understanding and something that looked a lot like love. More eggs, she offered, and in those simple words, Tommy heard what she was really saying. You belong here. You're safe here. You're home. And for the first time since his parents had gone away, Tommy allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The morning continued to unfold around them, filled with small moments that would later become precious memories. Sarah discovering the backyard garden with its late-blooming flowers, Max chasing squirrels in the autumn sunshine, Tommy helping James wash the breakfast dishes while Caroline made plans for school enrollment and doctor's appointments. Life was changing, transforming into something they hadn't dared to hope for during those long, lonely months. The path ahead still held challenges, questions to be answered, grief to be processed, trust to be built. But they would face it together, This newly formed family brought together by chance and choice, and the simple act of following a desperate child home. The autumn wind rustled through the trees outside, carrying with it the promise of change, of healing, of new beginnings. And in the warm kitchen of a house that had waited so long for children's laughter, for people and a dog began the gentle work of becoming a family. The days that followed flowed together like watercolors on canvas, each one bringing new challenges and triumphs as the makeshift family found its rhythm. The spare rooms upstairs slowly transformed from generic guest spaces into personalized sanctuaries. Sarah's walls bloomed with colorful drawings, scenes of their new family, including Max with an impossibly long tail that made Caroline laugh every time she saw it. Tommy's room accumulated books on his new shelf, each one a silent testament to the hours he spent reading with James in the evening, their voices mixing as they took turns with different characters. The first major hurdle came when James and Caroline had to register the children for school. The process involved explaining their situation to authorities, leading to a flurry of social worker visits and police investigations. Tommy's fear of separation resurged, manifesting in sleepless nights where he'd pace the hallway between his and Sarah's rooms. But James and Caroline proved true to their word, fighting tirelessly through legal channels to keep the family together. The investigation into their parents' disappearance revealed a tragic truth. A car accident on a rainy Chicago night had claimed both their lives. The news hit Tommy like a physical blow, though part of him had known all along. That night, he allowed himself to truly grieve for the first time, sobbing in Caroline's arms while James held Sarah, who was too young to fully comprehend the finality of it all. But even in grief, there was healing. The community rallied around them. Neighbors brought meals, teachers offered extra support, and James's regular customers at the store sent cards and small gifts. Tommy's former survival instincts slowly transformed into different kinds of strength. He learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, that trust could be rebuilt, that love could grow in the most unexpected places. Sarah flourished in her new first-grade class, her natural brightness returning like a FL hour turning toward the sun. Her teacher remarked on her resilience, her eagerness to learn, and her kind heart. She was always the first to welcome new students, perhaps remembering what it felt like to be lost and found. Max, too, underwent a transformation. Regular meals and veterinary care turned him from a scrawny survivor into a handsome, healthy dog. He appointed himself as the family's official guardian, sleeping in the hallway between the children's rooms at night and accompanying James to the store during the day, where he became something of a local celebrity. The legal adoption process moved forward, each signed document and court appearance bringing them closer to making official what their hearts already knew. Tommy found himself relaxing into the routine of normal life. Homework at the kitchen table, Sunday morning pancakes, movie nights with popcorn and blanket forts in the living room. One evening, as autumn deepened into winter, Tommy found James in his study, working on paperwork from the store. The man looked up with a smile, noting the serious expression on the boy's face. "Can we talk?" Tommy asked, perching on the edge of a leather armchair that had become his favorite reading spot. "Always," James replied, setting aside his work. Tommy fidgeted with the hem of his sweater, a new one, bought during a shopping trip with Caroline. "I've been thinking about the store," he said finally, "about how I used to steal from you." James waited patiently, knowing Tommy needed to find his own words. "I want to make it right," the boy continued. "Pay you back somehow. Maybe I could work there after school? Help stock shelves or something." James leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "Tommy, you don't owe me anything. You did what you had to do to protect your sister. That took courage." "But," Tommy started to protest. But James continued, "If you want to learn about running the store, I'd be proud to teach you. Not to pay back a debt, there isn't one, but because that's what fathers do. They teach their sons about life, about work, about responsibility. If you're interested." The word fathers hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Tommy felt tears prick at his eyes, but for once, he didn't try to hold them back. "I'd like that," he whispered. "Dad." The word felt strange on his tongue, not replacing his first father, but making room in his heart for a new kind of love. James's eyes glistened as he pulled Tommy into a hug, the kind that said everything words couldn't. Downstairs, they could hear Caroline and Sarah's laughter mixing with the sounds of dinner preparation and Max's excited barking. The house seemed to embrace them. Walls that had witnessed their journey from strangers to family now holding the warmth of their growing love. Winter settled over Springfield like a soft blanket, bringing with it holiday preparations and new traditions to blend with cherished memories. Tommy helped James string lights along the porch while Sarah and Caroline baked cookies, the scent of cinnamon and love filling every corner of their home. Each ornament hung on the Christmas tree told a story. Old ones from James and Caroline's early years together, new ones chosen by Tommy and Sarah to mark their first Christmas as a family. The journey that had begun with a desperate boy stealing bread had transformed into something beautiful and unexpected, a testimony to the power of compassion, the strength of children's hearts, and the endless possibilities of love. In following Tommy home that autumn day, James had found not just two children in need, but the missing pieces of his own heart. And as snow fell softly outside their windows, for people and a dog gathered in the warm light of their living room, each one knowing with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Home, together, at last. The wind whistled through the maple trees lining Cedar Grove Street, carrying autumn's first chill. 4-year-old Tommy Mitchell stood frozen at his bedroom window, his small finger pressed against the glass, pointing at something across the street. His father, James, watched with growing concern as tears streamed down his son's flushed cheeks. "What is it, buddy?" James knelt beside him, following Tommy's unwavering gaze to their neighbor's trash can. The black container stood innocuous against the backdrop of Mrs. Henderson's well-maintained garden. Yet Tommy's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "Bad," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. "Bad there, Daddy." James ran his fingers through his son's sandy blonde hair, noting how Tommy's skin felt clammy to the touch. This wasn't the first time his son had fixated on that particular spot. For 3 days straight, Tommy had woken up in the pre-dawn hours, padding to the window in his dinosaur pajamas, pointing and crying. Sarah, James's wife, appeared in the doorway, her nurse's scrubs already on for her early morning shift at Memorial Hospital. The shadows under her eyes spoke of another restless night spent listening to their son's distress. "Maybe we should check it out," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen him like this before." James hesitated, his law enforcement training making him acutely aware of how many missing person cases started with seemingly innocent observations. Tommy had always been sensitive. He cried when he saw injured birds, insisted on helping earthworms back to the grass after rain, and once spent an entire afternoon talking to a butterfly that had landed on their porch railing. But this was different. The intensity in his young eyes carried a weight that made James's chest tighten. The morning light was just beginning to paint the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold when James finally made his decision. He squeezed Sarah's hand, grabbed his jacket from the hook by the front door, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The concrete was cold beneath his feet, even through his shoes, and his breath formed small clouds in front of his face as he approached Mrs. Henderson's property. His heart thundered in his chest as he reached for the lid of the trash can. The metal handle was ice-cold against his palm, and for a moment, he almost turned back. But Tommy's tear-stained face flashed in his mind, and with a deep breath, he lifted the lid. The sound that escaped his throat was primal, a mixture of horror and disbelief. There, nestled among discarded newspapers and empty food containers, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket. As James reached in with trembling hands, he could see movement, subtle but unmistakable. The blanket shifted, revealing a perfect, miniature face, lips tinged with blue from the cold. "Sarah!" The scream tore from his throat as he cradled the infant against his chest, already running back across the street. "Sarah!" His wife appeared at the door, her professional calm evaporating the instant she saw what he carried. "Oh my God," she breathed, immediately switching into emergency mode. "Get him inside. Now!" They laid the baby on their kitchen table, Sarah's trained hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed the situation. The infant was newborn, probably no more than a day or two old, his skin cold and mottled. Tommy stood in the doorway. His tears finally stopped, watching with solemn understanding far beyond his years. "He's hypothermic, but he's breathing," Sarah announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Call 911. Now!" As James fumbled with his phone, Sarah wrapped the baby in warm blankets from their dryer, gently rubbing his tiny limbs to stimulate circulation. The infant's weak cries grew stronger with each passing minute, filling the kitchen with a sound that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Tommy approached cautiously, his small hand reaching out to touch the baby's blanket. "Safe now," he whispered, nodding to himself. "Safe now." The wail of approaching sirens cut through the morning quiet, and within minutes, their kitchen was filled with emergency personnel. The paramedics worked quickly, setting up a portable warming system and checking the baby's vital signs. Sarah refused to leave the infant's side, her nursing credentials allowing her to stay involved in his care. As they prepared to transport the baby to the hospital, one of the paramedics turned to James. "If you hadn't found him when you did..." She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. James looked at Tommy, who had retreated to a corner of the kitchen but maintained his vigilant watch over the proceedings. "It wasn't me," James said quietly. "It was my son." He knew. The morning dissolved into a blur of police statements and hospital visits. Sarah took an emergency personal day from work, accompanying the baby to the hospital while James stayed home with Tommy. Detective Marcus Chun, an old friend from the police academy, arrived to take their statement, his face grim as he documented the details. "The blanket might be our best lead," Marcus noted, carefully bagging it as evidence. "It's got some unique embroidery work. Looks custom-made." James nodded, his mind already racing through possibilities. In his 15 years on the force, he'd seen cases of abandoned babies before, but something about this felt different. The careful way the infant had been wrapped, the choice of location. It spoke of desperation rather than callousness. As the day progressed, Tommy finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep on the living room couch. James covered him with a blanket, marveling at his son's inexplicable connection to what had happened. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was Sarah. "The baby's going to make it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's responding well to treatment." "But James, there's something else. He has a mark on his wrist, some kind of symbol. The doctors think it might be important." James felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "What kind of symbol?" "It looks like a butterfly, but different. Stylized. The doctors are photographing it for evidence, but there's something else. I can't explain it, but I feel connected to him, like we were meant to find him." James looked at Tommy, sleeping peacefully now that his mission was accomplished. "Maybe we were," he replied softly. As the sun began to set on that extraordinary day, James couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had shifted irreversibly. He didn't know then that the butterfly mark would lead them down a path of discovery that would uncover a network of human trafficking, or that the baby, whom they would later name Michael, after Sarah's father, would become an integral part of their family. He couldn't have known that Tommy's inexplicable awareness would later be attributed to what doctors called heightened empathic sensitivity, or that this event would inspire Sarah to start a foundation for abandoned children that would save countless lives. The story was just beginning, its threads weaving together in ways none of them could have predicted. As James sat in the growing darkness, listening to Tommy's steady breathing and waiting for Sarah to return from the hospital, he felt a profound sense of purpose settling over him. Sometimes, he realized, the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary days, and the most powerful acts of love begin with simply paying attention to a child's tears. The days that followed blurred together in a whirlwind of police interviews and hospital visits. Detective Chen's investigation gained momentum when the blanket's distinctive embroidery led them to Sweet Dreams Baby Boutique, a small shop in the affluent part of town. The owner, Eleanor Wright, immediately recognized the handiwork. "Oh yes, those blankets were a special order," she said, pulling up records on her computer. "A man bought 24 of them about 6 months ago. Paid cash, but I remember him because he was so particular about the butterfly design. The security footage revealed a black SUV with tinted windows, and though the license plate was obscured, a distinctive dent in the rear quarter panel gave investigators their first solid lead. James found himself drawn deeper into the case, his paternal instinct fueling a determination that went beyond professional duty. Meanwhile, at home, Tommy developed an almost mystical bond with baby Michael during hospital visits. He would sit for hours by the incubator singing softly, songs no one had taught him, lullabies that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. The nurses noticed that Michael's vital signs stabilized whenever Tommy was near. Sarah threw herself into Michael's care with the same intensity she brought to all her cases, but there was something different this time. She would catch herself watching him sleep, counting his tiny fingers and toes, memorizing the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. The butterfly mark on his wrist became a source of both fear and fascination, a delicate purple design that seemed to shimmer under certain lights. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after Michael's discovery. Detective Chen's team traced the SUV to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building, once a textile factory, stood like a hulking shadow against the sky. Inside, they found evidence of a sophisticated trafficking operation. Forged documents, medical supplies, and most disturbingly, a nursery filled with empty cribs. Among the documents was a notebook filled with codes and dates. Forensics revealed that the butterfly mark was a brand used by the traffickers to identify premium merchandise, babies destined for wealthy buyers overseas. The discovery made James physically ill, but it also provided the key to unraveling the entire network. The investigation revealed a web of corruption that stretched from local hospitals to international adoption agencies. At the center was a woman named Sophia Kovac, whose own tragic story gradually came to light. She had been trafficking's victim herself, forced to work as a midwife for the organization. When Michael was born to a young mother named Grace Chun, no relation to the detective, Sophia had made a desperate choice. Grace had died in childbirth, but not before begging Sophia to save her son. Sophia, seeing in Grace's eyes the same desperation she had once known, decided to act. She wrapped Michael in one of the organization's distinctive blankets and left him where she knew he would be found. Not in front of a hospital or fire station where the traffickers might be watching, but in a quiet suburban neighborhood where a child's pure intuition would guide him to safety. As winter settled over the city, the case began making headlines. James and Sarah found themselves at the center of a media storm, but their focus remained on Michael. The adoption process, expedited due to the circumstances, moved forward with surprising speed. Tommy seemed to understand the gravity of the situation in his own way, proudly telling anyone who would listen about his new baby brother. The Mitchell home transformed gradually. A crib appeared in the spare room, stuffed animals accumulated in corners, and the sounds of Michael's laughter began to fill the spaces that had once seemed empty. Sarah took extended leave from the hospital, channeling her medical expertise into creating a foundation for trafficking survivors. She named it Butterfly's Wings, turning the trafficker's symbol of ownership into a message of hope and transformation. James's perspective on law enforcement shifted. He transferred to a special task force focused on child trafficking, working to prevent other families from being torn apart. The network they uncovered led to dozens of arrests and the rescue of 17 other infants. Each case filled him with a mixture of rage and determination, but he always came home to the reminder of why he fought: his own children, safe and loved. Tommy's gift, as they came to call it, didn't fade. He remained unusually attuned to others' suffering, often knowing when Michael needed comfort before the baby even began to cry. Child psychologists studied him, amazed by his emotional intelligence, but Tommy couldn't explain it. "I just know," he would say, shrugging his small shoulders. Sophia was eventually found in a safe house in Canada. Rather than face charges, she became a key witness, her testimony crucial in dismantling the trafficking ring. When she met the Mitchells, her hands trembled as she touched Michael's cheek. "I knew," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I knew when I saw your house, saw your little boy in the window. I knew he would be safe here." The butterfly mark on Michael's wrist faded over time, becoming a pale scar that told a story of survival. Sarah and James decided they would tell him the truth when he was old enough to understand. About Grace's sacrifice, Sophia's courage, and Tommy's inexplicable connection that had saved his life. Years passed, and the Mitchell family grew stronger. Tommy and Michael shared a bond that went beyond brotherhood, a connection forged in that pre-dawn moment when a child's tears alerted the world to a baby's silent cry for help. Sarah's foundation expanded, offering support to families affected by trafficking, while James's task force became a model for departments across the country. On Michael's 5th birthday, as the family gathered in their backyard under strings of twinkling lights, Tommy presented his brother with a drawing. In crayon strokes and glitter, he had recreated the butterfly mark, but transformed it into something beautiful. Wings spreading wide, breaking free from chains, soaring toward the sun. Sarah hung the drawing in the foundation's office, where it became a symbol of their mission. Visitors would often ask about it, and she would tell them the story, not just of how they found Michael, but of how love and intuition could pierce the darkest nights, how a child's persistence could unravel evil, and how family could be forged in the most unexpected moments. The Mitchell home became a sanctuary for other survivors, a place where healing began with simple acts of kindness. Tommy grew into his role as protector, his childhood sensitivity developing into a deep empathy that drew others to him. Michael thrived, showing no traces of his traumatic beginning except in his extraordinary capacity for compassion. And on quiet evenings, when the house was still, Sarah and James would often find their sons in the backyard, Tommy pointing out constellations to Michael, teaching him to find light in the darkness, just as he had done on that fateful morning years ago. The butterfly mark may have faded, but its legacy lived on in their unshakable bond, in their family's mission, and in the countless lives they touched through their journey of healing and hope. In the garden that evening, watching his sons trace imaginary constellations in the darkening sky, James felt a profound sense of how their lives had become intertwined with something larger than themselves. The Butterfly's Wings Foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations, becoming a beacon of hope for families across the country. Their modest suburban home had transformed into an unofficial sanctuary, its doors always open to those seeking refuge from similar circumstances. Tommy, now entering his teenage years, had developed an uncanny ability to connect with traumatized children. Social workers often called upon him to help comfort newly rescued kids, amazed at how his gentle presence could calm even the most distressed child. His childhood sensitivity had evolved into a remarkable emotional intelligence that drew people to him. Like moths to a flame, the butterfly mark on Michael's wrist had indeed faded to a silvery scar, but its significance in their lives only grew stronger. Sarah had incorporated the symbol into her medical practice, specializing in treating survivors of trafficking. Her patients often spoke of how the butterfly imagery helped them reclaim their own stories, transforming a mark of ownership into a symbol of liberation. Detective Chen's investigation had snowballed into an international operation, exposing trafficking rings across 3 continents. The evidence they gathered from that first warehouse led to the rescue of hundreds of children, each case adding another layer to their understanding of the network's complexity. Sophia's testimony proved invaluable, her intimate knowledge of the organization helping authorities stay one step ahead of the traffickers' evolving tactics. The Mitchell story became a case study in law enforcement training programs, highlighting the importance of listening to children's intuition. Tommy's role in Michael's rescue inspired a new protocol for handling cases involving young witnesses, acknowledging that sometimes the most crucial information came from the most unexpected sources. Michael grew into a thoughtful, creative child with an old soul's wisdom. His early trauma left no visible scars except in his extraordinary capacity for empathy. He showed a particular talent for art, filling sketchbooks with intricate butterfly designs that seemed to capture both fragility and strength. His art teacher remarked that his drawings had a healing quality to them, as if each stroke of his pencil was mending something broken in the world. Sarah's medical research into early childhood trauma led to groundbreaking findings about resilience and recovery. She discovered that children like Michael, rescued and placed in loving homes during their earliest days, showed remarkable adaptability. Her work challenged existing theories about permanent damage from early trauma, offering hope to countless families. The Foundation's reach extended beyond direct intervention in trafficking cases. They established scholarship programs for survivors, therapy groups for families, and training workshops for law enforcement. Tommy often spoke at these events, his simple story of watching from a window becoming a powerful testimony to the importance of trusting one's instincts. During one particularly moving Foundation event, an elderly woman approached the family. She introduced herself as Grace Chin's grandmother, having recognized Michael from news coverage. She brought with her a small box of mementos, photographs, letters, and a hand-knitted baby blanket that Grace had made during her pregnancy. The meeting filled in crucial pieces of their story, helping Michael understand the courage that had marked his entry into the world. The butterfly theme wove itself through every aspect of their lives. The garden Sarah planted bloomed with butterfly-attracting flowers, creating a living memorial to transformation and hope. Local artists donated butterfly sculptures to the Foundation, each one telling a different story of survival and renewal. The symbol that had once marked children for sale now marked them for salvation. As Michael approached his 10th birthday, the family decided to honor Grace's memory by establishing a maternal health clinic in her name. The Grace Chin Memorial Clinic would serve vulnerable mothers, providing not just medical care, but also protection from trafficking networks. Sophia, now working as an advocate for survivors, helped design the clinic's security protocols. Tommy's gift for healing continued to evolve in unexpected ways. He began studying psychology, determined to understand the science behind his intuitive abilities. His research into childhood trauma and emotional intelligence attracted attention from leading institutions, opening new avenues for understanding how children process and respond to others' pain. The warehouse where Michael had been held was eventually demolished, but not before the Mitchells organized a ceremony of transformation. Survivors and their families gathered to paint butterfly murals on its walls, their colorful wings a testament to freedom and resilience. When the building came down, pieces of the painted walls were preserved and incorporated into monuments at healing centers across the country. James's work with the task force led to the development of new technologies for tracking trafficking networks. He never forgot the feeling of lifting that trash can lid, of finding Michael among the discarded newspapers. That memory drove him to search darker corners, to look where others might not think to look, always believing that rescue was possible. The story of the Mitchell family became interwoven with hundreds of other stories, each one adding new dimensions to their understanding of love, courage, and healing. Their home remained a gathering place for survivors and their families, a place where transformation wasn't just possible, but expected, where butterflies weren't just symbols but promises kept. On summer evenings, when the garden filled with actual butterflies drawn to Sarah's flowers, the family would often sit together, watching nature's display of transformation. Michael would sketch, Tommy would tell stories to visiting children, and Sarah and James would hold hands, marveling at how one moment of attention to a child's distress had rippled outward to touch so many lives. The butterfly mark that had once branded Michael for sale had instead marked him for a different destiny, one of healing, hope, and the kind of love that transforms not just individuals but entire communities. In their family story, tragedy had become triumph, darkness had given way to light, and the simple trust of a child had grown into a movement that continued to spread its wings, touching lives far beyond their quiet suburban street. As butterflies danced through their garden in the fading light, the Mitchell story continued to unfold in ways that touched lives far beyond their neighborhood. The ripple effects of that cold autumn morning had grown into waves of change, transforming not just their family, but entire communities. Michael's artistic talents blossomed into a full-fledged career as he entered his teenage years. His butterfly-inspired artwork began appearing in galleries across the country, each piece telling a story of transformation. He developed a unique technique that incorporated hidden symbols within his paintings, subtle butterfly marks that spoke to survivors without revealing their stories to casual observers. His exhibitions became gathering places for the healing community, spaces where silence could speak and scars could shine. Tommy's path led him deeper into the field of trauma psychology. His research into childhood intuition and emotional intelligence revolutionized how experts understood early trauma detection. He developed a groundbreaking therapy program that combined traditional counseling with what he called intuitive listening, teaching caregivers to recognize and trust the subtle signs children often showed when others were in danger. Sarah's medical practice evolved into a comprehensive healing center that integrated physical care with emotional and spiritual support. The Grace Chin Memorial Clinic expanded to multiple locations, each facility designed with butterfly gardens and art therapy spaces. She pioneered a treatment approach that recognized the body's capacity to transform trauma into strength, just as a butterfly emerges stronger from its chrysalis. James's work with law enforcement took an unexpected turn when he discovered patterns in trafficking networks that mimicked butterfly migration routes. This insight led to the development of predictive models that helped authorities anticipate and prevent trafficking operations before they could take root. His methodology became known as the Butterfly Effect Protocol, acknowledging how small interventions could create massive positive changes in the fight against human trafficking. The Butterfly's Wings Foundation grew into an international organization with branches in countries across the globe. Each location maintained the intimate, family-centered approach that had marked its beginnings in the Mitchell's home. The Foundation Scholarship Program, named after Sofia Kovac, helped survivors pursue education and career opportunities, transforming their experiences into tools for helping others. Sofia herself became a powerful voice for change, testifying before international tribunals and advising governments on anti-trafficking policies. She never forgot the night she had left Michael in that trash can, knowing somehow that Tommy would sense his presence. Her testimony always began with that story, a moment of desperate faith in a child's capacity to see what adults might miss. The butterfly mark that had once branded children for sale became a symbol of hope recognized worldwide. Survivors began getting butterfly tattoos over their trafficking scars, reclaiming their bodies and their stories. Artists collaborated with Michael to create public installations that honored survivors while educating communities about trafficking's reality and prevention. Grace Chin's story, too, found its place in the larger narrative. Her grandmother became a regular presence at Foundation events, sharing stories of Grace's dreams for her unborn child. These stories helped other families understand the complex circumstances that sometimes led to desperate choices, fostering compassion alongside justice. The Mitchells' home remained a sanctuary, its doors open to those seeking refuge and hope. The garden Tommy and Michael had once used as their stargazing spot became a gathering place for healing circles, where survivors shared their stories under the open sky. Butterfly bushes lined the pathways, their flowers attracting both insects and metaphors for transformation. As Michael grew older, he began to understand his role in a larger story of healing and hope. His art evolved to include interactive installations where visitors could add their own butterfly marks, creating collective works that spoke to the power of community in healing. His childhood trauma transformed into a source of creative energy that helped others find beauty in their own scars. Tommy's intuitive gifts matured into a profound understanding of human connection. He could often sense when someone needed support before they themselves realized it, a skill that made him invaluable in crisis intervention. His childhood experience of knowing something was wrong became the foundation for training others to trust their instincts when confronting potential trafficking situations. The warehouse site where Michael had been held was transformed into a memorial garden, its paths lined with butterfly sculptures created by survivors. Each year, on the anniversary of Michael's rescue, the community gathered there for a ceremony of remembrance and hope. Butterflies released during these ceremonies seemed to dance with particular purpose, as if carrying messages between past and present. Sarah's research into trauma and resilience continued to break new ground. She discovered that survivors often developed extraordinary capacities for healing others, their wounds becoming windows through which they could see and understand others' pain. This finding led to new therapeutic approaches that recognize trauma survivors not as victims, but as potential healers. James's work with the task force expanded to include training programs for community members, teaching them to recognize signs of trafficking and trust their instincts about suspicious situations. He never tired of telling Michael's story, of how a child's tears had cracked open a case that seemed invisible to adult eyes. The butterfly mark that had once symbolized ownership became a badge of survival, then of triumph, and finally of transformation. In art galleries, hospitals, police stations, and community centers around the world, butterfly symbols appeared as quiet reminders that healing was possible, that dark marks could become beautiful scars, and that the most profound changes often began with the simplest acts of attention. The butterfly symbols that dotted the global landscape became more than mere markers of survival. They evolved into beacons of active change. Communities worldwide began adopting the butterfly effect protocol, creating networks of vigilant citizens trained to recognize and respond to signs of trafficking. The movement that had started with a child's tears in a suburban window had grown into a worldwide web of protection and hope. Michael's artistic influence reached new heights as he entered his 20s. His work began incorporating augmented reality elements, allowing viewers to scan his butterfly paintings with their phones to access resources for trafficking prevention and survivor support. Each piece became a portal to healing, connecting viewers directly to local support services and educational materials. Museums around the world competed to host his installations, not just for their artistic merit, but for their power to transform communities. Tommy's research into childhood intuition led to groundbreaking discoveries about the nature of human connection. He identified what he called empathic resonance patterns, measurable changes in brain activity that occurred when children sensed others in distress. This work revolutionized both psychology and law enforcement, leading to new protocols for interviewing child witnesses and assessing potential trafficking situations. His findings suggested that children's intuitive abilities, far from being mysterious or supernatural, were actually sophisticated pattern recognition systems that adults had learned to suppress. Sarah's medical practice expanded into genetic research, exploring how trauma could leave physical markers that might be transformed through targeted intervention. Her work with epigenetics revealed that the butterfly mark carried by trafficking victims might have activated dormant genetic patterns related to resilience and healing. This discovery led to new therapeutic approaches that combined physical healing with psychological transformation. The Grace Chin Memorial Clinic network grew to include specialized research facilities studying the intersection of trauma, genetics, and healing. Grace's grandmother's stories about her family's history of intuitive abilities added another layer to their understanding of how Tommy had known to watch that window. The research suggested that intuition might run in families, passed down through generations like an invisible inheritance of protection. James's work with law enforcement evolved into an international consulting practice, teaching police forces worldwide how to integrate community awareness with technical surveillance. He developed training programs that helped officers recognize the subtle patterns of trafficking operations while building stronger connections with the communities they served. His approach, combining high-tech tools with human intuition, became known as the Mitchell Method and was adopted by law enforcement agencies across the globe. The Butterfly's Wings Foundation established sister organizations in countries throughout Asia, Europe, and Africa, each adapting the Mitchell family's approach to local cultural contexts. These centers became hubs of healing and transformation, where survivors could find not just safety, but purpose. Many went on to become advocates and healers themselves, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of recovery and empowerment. Sophia's testimony before international tribunals led to sweeping changes in global anti-trafficking laws. Her story of leaving Michael, where she knew he would be found, became a powerful argument for understanding trafficking as a complex human issue requiring nuanced solutions. She worked closely with the Mitchells to develop training programs for law enforcement and social services, teaching them to look beyond simple categories of victim and perpetrator. The butterfly mark that had once branded children for sale was now studied by anthropologists and sociologists as a symbol of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and transformation. Academic papers explored how the trafficking network's symbol had been reclaimed and repurposed by survivors, becoming a marker of resilience rather than ownership. Universities began offering courses in transformative justice, using the Mitchell case as a central study in how communities could turn tragedy into triumph. The Mitchells' home garden expanded into a community healing space, with neighbors donating adjacent lots to create a sprawling butterfly sanctuary. The space became a living laboratory where trauma survivors could work with plants and insects, finding healing in the natural cycles of transformation. Master gardeners worked alongside therapists to develop horticultural healing programs that were replicated at trauma centers worldwide. Michael's artistic practice deepened to include work with traumatized children, teaching them to express their experiences through art. He developed a technique he called butterfly mapping, where survivors could trace their journeys of healing through collaborative art pieces. These maps became powerful tools for understanding the geography of recovery, showing how individual healing journeys connected to create larger patterns of community transformation. Tommy's gift for sensing others' distress evolved into a sophisticated system for training caregivers and first responders. He could articulate the subtle cues he had unconsciously recognized as a child, teaching others to notice the small signs that might indicate someone in danger. His training programs became mandatory for child protection workers worldwide, creating a network of professionally trained intuitive observers. The warehouse site's memorial garden attracted visitors from around the world, each bringing stories of transformation and hope. The butterfly sculptures created by survivors were regularly updated, with new pieces added as more stories of rescue and recovery emerged. The space became a living archive of healing, where each butterfly carried the weight of history while pointing toward future possibility. Sarah's research into trauma and resilience expanded to include studies of collective healing, how communities could transform their wounds into sources of strength. She documented cases where entire neighborhoods had shifted their culture after participating in butterfly marking ceremonies, becoming more alert to signs of trafficking and more supportive of survivors in their midst. The ripple effects of that cold morning continued to spread, touching lives in ways the Mitchells could never have imagined. Their story became woven into the fabric of countless other stories, creating a tapestry of healing that stretched across continents. The butterfly mark that had once signified ownership had become a symbol of freedom, its wings carrying messages of hope to those still waiting to be found. In the quiet moments of evening, when the garden filled with the flutter of wings and the murmur of healing voices, the Mitchells would often gather to watch the sun set. They had learned that transformation was not a single moment, but a continuous process, that healing was not a destination, but a journey shared with others. Their story had become part of something larger than themselves, a movement of hope that continued to grow, one butterfly mark at a time.